All right.
Okay. So I hope this is working out and that everybody now watching us on Crowdcast having this panel discussion. I'd like to welcome everyone to the panel discussion of day 2 of May 2020, with the subject being consciousness in brains and machines. You probably recognize everybody here. Just one person you have not seen yet today, that's Lucia Melloni. And I'm really happy that Lucia could be with us now. She wasn't able to be with us earlier, so we managed to convince her to make it to the panel discussion. Very briefly, I'd like to introduce Lucia Melloni. So Lucia Melloni is currently group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. She's professor at New York University Langstone Health, holds a PhD in psychology, and is fellow at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies in the research group Deconstructing and Reconstructing Consciousness, an interdisciplinary approach to a perennial puzzle. Her research centers on domain general cortical computations, predictive coding, brain plasticity, language, and consciousness. And her research, she uses a combination of neuroimaging, electrophysiology, and behavior to dissect the neural circuits that give rise to perception and cognition in humans. And I obviously know a lot of her work from her work also on oscillations, neural oscillations, and the role of neural oscillations in consciousness, which I'm particularly interested in. So welcome, Lucia Melloni, to this panel discussion, and welcome also to all our other panelists to the discussion.
Thank you, Karim.
This is a little bit complicated, but here's how we propose to deal with this. What we're going to do is the following. We have prepared a number of, let's say, slightly confusing or provocative questions.
It's a tradition, Karim.
Yes, it is a tradition. It is our main tradition. We come up with questions where a little bit confusing, but just to get the discussion going and then see where this takes us. So we've posted 3 questions, and then there are polls, not to the speakers, but to the attendees. So now I'm telling the attendees, please click on polls that you see just next to ask a question in the Crowdcast. You'll see 3 questions there, and we'd like to hear what the attendees think of these new questions. I will be reporting also the results to the panel over here. So take your time, we'll come back to those in a second, but please, attendees, now you can go ahead and answer those questions. What we will also do now is I have a number of questions I'll be addressing to some of you and facilitate, hopefully get the discussion going. And then in the second part of the panel discussion, we'll be opening up to the questions asked by the audience. So it's first us talking, and then we'll go and pick some questions from the audience. So first of all, I'd like to start with a slightly controversial question. If somebody jumps in, that'll be okay. Otherwise, I'll direct this question to someone. And that's basically consciousness in a dish. Okay, so brain organoids. This is something we've heard a lot about. Suscitates some, a little bit of a mixture of fascination, but also a lot of dubious thoughts whether this makes sense or doesn't make sense. Can consciousness arise in a dish? Can it arise from an organoid, a brain organoid, for instance? I know Anil has written also about this, but anyone feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll start then, since we, so about a year ago, with my colleagues Tim Bain and Marcello Massimini, we started thinking about potential, what we call islands of awareness. So this would be the idea, it's kind of the old philosophical thing of a brain in a vat. Could you have consciousness without any body or any interaction? In a sense, it goes against what I was saying in my talk about intersective inference, but it's worth considering. And one of these cases were these cases of brain organoids. We also thought about hemispherotomies, which is a kind of neurosurgical intervention where you disconnect an entire cortical hemisphere, but it remains within the brain and it remains vascularized and sort of alive. And the other case was these ex-cranio pig brains, where people will remove an entire brain from a dead pig and sort of hook it up to a pump and reanimate it. All of these cases seem to be potential for to have enough brain material correctly organized to potentially be an island of awareness. We're particularly concerned about organoids because there's huge medical potential for them as models of neurodevelopmental disorders, but the scale is enormous, right? I mean, you can just make infinite quantities of these things, grow them in the lab. How to know whether these things could be aware? Already in some experiments from the lab of Alison Watry, they were reporting that you can see EEG signatures from brain organoids. that resemble preterm human infants, premature babies, in some sense.
But Anil, I think the examples you give are extremely different from each other. In the case of an entire hemisphere, there will be an enormous architecture in the system. And perhaps it's possible that the system keeps some dynamic states like the one I was describing. You could look at resting state activity and see that there is a diversity of states and decide that it's conscious. But I think it's completely unlikely to happen in current organoids, at least. It's a phantasm that they have the architecture which is needed to have this sort of complexity of states. So maybe you're mixing very different things here.
Oh no, they are completely different, and we sort of make that point too. The only thing they share is the lack of a body and an environment. That's the thing they share. Otherwise, they're entirely different. So, hemispherotomy hemisphere has had an interaction with a body and environment in the past, and it's hugely structured in many ways that organoids lack. No, I agree with your intuition that organoids are very unlikely to be the loci of sentient states, but there's an ethical concern here because the sort of scale of production of these things is massive.
But I guess let me see where I understand the background of the question from Karim, right? So it's maybe it's the maybe in the current architecture they might not have sentience, but I guess the question is, what would it take for them to become sentient, and how would we know? And I think that is the background of the question.
Yes, the how would
right?
we know is
so
is,
you know
is
the
And I would just draw out that different, this is implicit in what we've been discussing, but different views are going to have different implications about this. So I think a view about consciousness that is just dependent on internal complexity or predominantly dependent on internal complexity or features of a global workspace is going to be different from a view that requires some sort of coupling with the environment, which you still might have even, say, in a reanimated pig brain or in a hemisphere because of the past history. But I think it's important that these views have different predictions, and right now I think we don't have enough evidence to really decide between them. So I think this is a really important issue to get a handle on.
One concrete thing that was suggested is that you can measure something like the perturbation complexity index of an organoid, ping it with some electrical activity and calculate the compressibility of the electrical echo. The problem is how you interpret that. We can interpret it in humans because there are baselines that we can use within and now increasingly across individuals and labs. But if you get a PCI of 0.46 for an organoid, what does that even mean?
Right. Okay.
in some sense, sorry.
Go ahead, Lucia. Then I want to add something.
In some sense, the question, it goes at the core of what we're trying to understand, right? So it's very easy, or not so easy, but like in humans, we tend to infer and we tend to attribute that there is a similar kind of consciousness and so on and so forth. And sometimes we fail. I'm not a synesthete. I try to attribute the experience of a synesthete. I grossly fail, but but we try. But we try, right? Now what happens with, I think what Stan is trying to do with monkeys. How do we infer in monkeys, right? And then you can go lower and lower and lower and lower and lower, right? And up to down to the level of organoids and bacteria or whatever. Now the marriage of like calculating PCI already bets on assuming that a particular construct that you would make you would use to make inferences on, right? Which for some people they can. Some people believe in that, some people don't. So I think that we still need to do some more work to try and understand the inferential gaps that remain, and even for monkeys, even for babies. We, get into organoids. It would be really interesting, but I would have loved to know whether my 34-week baby in my womb was conscious or not. Right.
Right. So to put it very simply, I think we can have these really excellent markers of consciousness in beings, in creatures that we know are capable of consciousness, but until we have an excellent understanding of mechanism, it's going to be very hard to extrapolate out to other kinds of systems like organoids.
And that's exactly the strategy, I think. At least this is my strategy. We start with organisms that can report, we try to describe in computational terms what happens when they do and what sort of contents can they report. And then progressively we'll get to a theory. I have to say the state of theorizing is still very primitive. I'm looking forward to Joshua because I'm hoping that he may, make us progress in terms of understanding better what these computations are that are occurring at the level of a conscious representation. He seemed to have a number of suggestions. Can they be turned into signatures of consciousness?
That's a good question. Right now, what we're focusing on, because our audience has been mostly machine learning people, is what advantages they provide. These inductive biases that seems to be associated with conscious processing. And we haven't focused much of how would we test these in brains, but I think that's a very good question.
Maybe this is an opportunity for me to jump in. Also, I want to get moving so that we can go through a number of questions before we get to the audience. Unless somebody wanted to add something to this, but I'll be moving on to the second question if that's okay with everyone. My second question relates now to the idea that seems to be this consensus among some researchers that more robust and more generalizable AI could be achieved by endowing AI with consciousness, or we use the term functions of consciousness. Many of you are very aware of this discussion, but I'm just going to throw in maybe a criticism of this and see what you think about this. What if somebody told us, well, do you really think you need functions of consciousness for better, more performant, more generalized AI? Wouldn't metacognition be enough? So if you could endow the machine with the ability to reflect upon its own reflection, cognition upon cognition, would that be sufficient for the types of aims we're discussing? Do we actually need to get to the level of consciousness? There are several embedded sub-questions in there, but maybe somebody feels...
Well, in the science paper where we discussed the possibility of consciousness in machines, we try to say that in our current discussion on consciousness, there are really two different dimensions. One is access to information, and the other is metacognition, self-knowledge. And so in answer to your question, I think, no, it's not needed. It's just a different dimension of what we mean by consciousness. There are some systems, like the experiments I described in the monkey, we don't really ask at all about the metacognition of the monkey. We just ask him to be in the world and to perceive a particular piece of information. And I think that's enough to study consciousness. But there is this second meaning of consciousness, which is really self-consciousness, reflexive, which the same organism may or may not have, I think. But it's not strictly needed to define one particular aspect of consciousness. Now, it's super interesting, I think. It's very, very interesting to ask what kind of machine can develop a model of itself, and why would it be useful, again, as Joshua was asking. I think it's very useful to have a repertoire of what you know. If you don't know that you don't know, or if you don't know that you know, you are in poor shape. You need something like a repertoire to tell you when to apply your knowledge and when it has a good chance of succeeding. So that's why self-knowledge is so important. And probably intelligent machines in the future should have more self-knowledge. I don't think that they have much at the moment. Just apply what they know.
Metacognition would be able to do a large part of that, knowing, monitoring your performance, knowing what you did well, what you did wrong, knowing your goals in a metacognitive.
Yeah. And there are some, Joshua, surely you can comment on this. There are machines that begin to do this, right?
Yeah. I don't, of course, reinforcement learning agents are doing a little bit of this, but the kind of metacognition that is really interesting is about the control mechanism for deciding what you're going to be thinking about next. So in the experiments, for example, that Stan talked about, they're simple enough that it's very straightforward. There's not a big choice about what to attend because there's a dominance input that really you want to pretend. But if you're more in a mode of imagination, planning, and reasoning, then it's much less clear, and you probably need some sophisticated metacognition to decide what to think about next, and that's where you need a model of yourself, right? A model of your own thinking process. So maybe the two parts that we've been talking about, the access and the metacognition, actually are not completely disjoint. That the metacognition helps, combined with the access abilities, to control the access abilities, especially when it comes to, from memory or from imagination, planning and things like that. That's where it becomes, I think, really useful. And by the way, this is really the idea that I understand, the way that I understand the ideas from Michael Graziano. From a machine learning perspective.
May I ask you a question there? So from your talk, when you were talking about the inductive biases, right? So in essence, you may want to have a system that can infer causal structure, right? Now, I think that coming back to Karim's question is, do we need consciousness to have systems that infer causal structure? And the question might be yes or no, and especially if you understand consciousness as no function but just sentience. Right. So the fact that
I don't know what these words mean. I cannot answer that question because I don't know what is consciousness. I don't know what is sentience. So I can't answer.
Well, but think about let me just just to make it very concrete, so that we can advance, right? So imagine that you have a scene, an event, and you need to understand that there is a kid throwing a ball.
Yes.
Right? That's an inductive bias. You need to understand that there is physics, that there is an intention, that there is an agent, that there is an object, that there is so all of those things. I can imagine that one day, hopefully machines, will be smart enough to understand, to parse that, right?
That's right.
Now, do they need to be conscious, have an experience of red, that the ball was red? I don't know. They will understand the causal structure of the event.
Right? I think these questions cannot be answered until we know what consciousness means. But let me try to say something about what you're saying. Until we have theories of, say, qualia, which is what you were getting to, that are like mechanical, that we can simulate in a computer, and for which there is a meaningful evolutionary value, I don't think we can say much. So I think we have to work on these theories and validate them both on the neuroscience side and on the AI side. The AI side meaning that we can see that it brings value and it can be doing something that makes sense, that we can simulate and we can replicate. I do think that there is value to the so I do think that the qualia is a side effect of something that has value. That's my feeling, right? So if you go back to what I was saying earlier, that metacognition rides on top of the access capabilities in order to allow you to do more sophisticated thinking. And you don't have conscious access to that model of yourself that is going on in metacognition, right? You don't, but it still may create that as a side effect. It may create that perception of two levels of the separation between your view of yourself and what is actually going on in your brain is two different things. So I don't think we know enough, but we need to build those theories, and these theories have to be sufficiently precise that we can simulate them in machines and test them in neuroscience. I'm sure we will find answers if we don't destroy the planet before then.
Maybe I can jump in here, because so I think there's always a danger in getting stalled on definitions here, but we have some sort of consensus agreement that consciousness involves some kind of subjective experience, which doesn't sort of apply to any kind of mechanism. But there are some things that just don't have that property. I also wanted to clarify this opportunity to clarify the thing you disagreed with me. One of the things you disagreed with Yoshua in your talk, and this sort of idea that intelligence and awareness are completely unrelated. I don't think they're completely unrelated. In fact, there are things that we can do, and these are the discussions you and I have had a number of times. There are things that we can do and that are strongly associated with human consciousness. And you've mentioned a few of these examples already. And so those are, I think, the real opportunity. One of them is metacognition, of course. Another is access. Another is perceptual integration. These are ways in which taking inspiration from the mechanisms that explain properties associated with human consciousness, I think, can indeed enhance AI without even worrying about the question, am I building an actually conscious machine? I'm just building a machine that has the functions that are associated with consciousness here. But so what I sort of caution against that sort of treating intelligence and consciousness as somehow coextensive. So the thing that we've argued about before or discussed before is this association of consciousness with system 2 and unconsciousness with system 1 processing. And I think there are lots of departures from that. So I can imagine you can have systems that...
Give me one counterexample.
Well, I think low-level pain perception, the sort of low-level, very perceptual phenomenology.
Why is that a counterexample? I mean, your conscious access allows you to access any part of what your nervous system has access to. I mean, a large part of what your nervous system has access to. So why couldn't you have access to low-level pain?
So, well, think of a non-human species that might not have the kind of global broadcast and generalization capabilities that we characteristically associate.
Okay.
You think in humans, are you going to call them unconscious because of the lack of that capacity, even if they've got the perceptual and sensory systems that are geared towards self-preservation, given the evolution?
Okay, we're back to the problem of definitions. I don't,
Well, I mean,
my answer, I don't know what consciousness is.
Well, I mean, unless you want to restrict it to humans, in virtue of humans being smart, I think that was too restrictive.
No. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say that I agree that there may be different axes. I mean, we already know that there are different axes of intelligence, right? So I can easily imagine a kind of super intelligent search engine that can answer any of the questions about human knowledge, and even in some sense understands a lot of things about the world. It's not just like a table lookup, but still may not have consciousness in the sense that, say, Stan is talking about. Or even metacognition and subjective perception. So I could easily imagine that we could have machines that are very intelligent in some ways, but don't have. In fact, we already have these machines. I mean, like AlphaGo is in a specialized way. It's already something like this. So yeah, I agree with you that there are different dimensions, but I do think that they're usually correlated because evolution, created conscious functionalities because they were useful.
Yeah, I mean, let me give just one last example. I'll shut up because I think they're correlated in a very interesting way. Think about the emotion of sadness. Maybe it doesn't take much cognitive sophistication to be sad. It takes a little more cognitive sophistication to be disappointed because you have to have expected something to be better. Yeah. It takes even more cognitive sophistication to experience regrets because then you have to have counterfactuals. And then the thing I get most of in my life is anticipatory regret, where I know something's going to turn out bad, and I do it anyway, and it does turn out bad. Yep. And you've got to have a remarkably sort of human form of stupidity to be able to experience that kind of emotional state. So there is a correlation, but the core experience of sadness doesn't require all this other, reflection projecting out into the future and the past. They change it, but they don't seem to me to be constitutively necessary for the emotion, which still has value for the creature.
I'm sure it does. Sure it does. Go ahead, Karim.
Great. So I'd like to jump in so that we get the discussion moving forward. Unfortunately, we have to accept the idea that we'll be just scratching the surface here in all of the discussions we're having today, because just planting our ideas out there, and hopefully this will lead to more discussions.
I'll just say 2 words.
Go ahead.
Graded consciousness, right? You have many different features, and you can have in different levels. Go ahead, Karim.
Graded contents, it's completely fine, but with a particular window in which they dominate the picture. That would be fine with me.
Okay, there's some consensus. That's good. It allows me to move on to the next. And this is maybe more oriented, first of all, towards the philosopher among us, so Lisa. So AI surpasses human performance on many tasks. And so my question relates to the hard, solving the hard question, the hard problem. Is there any way you can see a scenario by which AI in the future will be able to answer questions that are too hard for us humans to address? Specifically, this idea of the brain looking to solve itself, like the brain being, if it was simple enough to understand, it would be so simple it couldn't something of this contradiction. So if we have these AI machines that become more and more powerful in terms of solving these types of problems, is there any way, a scenario you can see that an AI will be proposing solutions to the hard problem, which we might not understand, but we'll just, believe on good faith because the machines are much more superpower intelligent than we are, and we think that's maybe the solution? It's a controversial and silly question, but I'd just like to hear your thought on that.
Thanks, Karim. No, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think that the way the hard problem has been traditionally posed, what people are looking for is a transparent explanation of what it's like to experience something in terms of underlying neural or computational mechanisms, and that's the way that Dave Chalmers puts it forward, and many other philosophers. And I think that as posed, that problem is probably insoluble because, but not because consciousness is special, but because many higher level kinds are not transparently explained by the lower level kinds that generate them. And so there will be many cases where you have higher level kinds that obtain in virtue of lower level kinds in very complex ways that such that the explanations are not transparent. And so I think that AI could definitely help us. We know that AI is much better at recognition of certain kinds of patterns. For example, with AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero, we know that they're detecting patterns and that expert Go players weren't aware of previously, kinds of moves or strategy patterns. And so I think applying the techniques of AI to studying consciousness in the brain is a really excellent idea. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that AIs would have the kind of intelligence that we think is distinctive of understanding, that they would be able to understand things that we couldn't. And so just to return to the previous discussion, I think distinguishing different kinds of intelligence is really important. So I think the kind of intelligence that's related to understanding is the one I was trying to grapple with in my talk when I was talking about relevance. So I think current AI systems are not sensitive to relevance, whereas even fairly primitive animals like mice and squirrels are. And so if we think about trying to create AIs that are actually sensitive to relevance relations, that's going to mean creating AIs that are where the systems level description involves them interacting with the world in ways that we don't currently have. So if you had an AI that could do that, then I would think maybe the AI could have understanding in a sense that similar to what we have.
Okay, does anybody want to come? I saw Anil moving around in his chair.
I do that a lot. No, I completely actually agree with Lisa there that there seems to be this desire that a satisfying scientific explanation of consciousness should give you this intuitive, like, aha, it has to be that way. And that's not generally a criterion that we always apply to other things. It's like quantum physics is just not that intuitive, but it works. I mean, it just has to run through all the way. It doesn't have to give you that sense of, oh yeah, that makes sense to me because I'm conscious. It seems to be because we're trying to explain our own experience, we add these extra, we raise the bar. A satisfying account of consciousness should explain and predict and control the target properties, and those now are subjective properties and subjective.
In fact, I think your analogy with quantum physics is very interesting because it may be even worse in the sense that it's very possible we end up with an understanding of consciousness that is very much in contradiction with our very strong intuitions from internal perception about consciousness.
Yeah, and I think people that are, for instance, arguing that that what we think of consciousness is an illusion, the sort of perspective of illusionism is kind of going in that direction. I don't fully buy into that, but I think it certainly is an interesting possibility. We have to, but the other, just on
without being an illusion, it could be just like a wrong picture of what is really going on.
Yeah, but just to your specific question, Karim, I mean, this idea that we might not be clever enough to understand a solution, even if it was presented to us by an AI or an alien or whatever else, I think that's Colin McGinn is known for this perspective of Mysterianism. There is a solution, but we just won't understand it in the same way that a frog will never understand cryptocurrency, however hard you try to explain Bitcoin to a frog. The issue with that, of course, is, well, what do? You just give up. And the beautiful thing about science, especially when it's assisted by philosophy and by technology, is that we've now able to understand things that seemed impossible to understand even in principle. It's cumulative in that sense. There may well be some upper bound, but we have no idea where that upper bound actually is. So we should just keep going and try.
I want to make a comment about this. There's already a number of cases in science where we can't have, or we don't seem to be able, and probably will never be able to come up with an intuitive understanding of a phenomenon. Yet we can have like some principles, like laws of physics. Say, think about climatology. There are lots of things that are happening in the climate that the only way that we can verify is by running a very complex simulation that no human brain can actually grasp at a intuitive level, at a conscious level. What we can grasp are the underlying equations, of course, because we program them. But it's very likely that there are phenomena like this. In fact, I think a lot of what's going on in our brain is like this, that we may understand some principles, but the only way to explain some of the phenomena that we observe could be through simulations or having the real thing in front of us.
But Joshua, maybe this is a philosophical question a little bit, but you think that there is a universal set of laws, or maybe I formulate it differently, a universal form of laws, so that the human brain would essentially have the capacity to capture any law that's out there. That seems to be the case at the moment. We are describing the quantum and the cosmos at incredibly different scales, and biology and so on. Or could there be another level of machines that have completely different laws out there that we couldn't imagine?
So in line with what I said about inductive biases, I think our brain has a prior that makes it easy for us to understand some aspects of the world, like, for example, through equations. And there could be aspects of the world that are very hard for us to grasp within that kind of mental framework that our brain allows us to have. And so, yes, I think so the answer is number two. Whether these other explanations are important to really act usefully in the world or not, I don't know. But it's possible. It's very possible.
If it's just a prior, we can overcome it, maybe. If it's a real structural representation, then we can.
Even if you tell somebody that they have a wrong prior, it's hard to go against your visual illusions, for example.
Okay, so maybe we're soon going to turn to the questions by the audience. I maybe one further comment before we do that. The notion of using, for example, psychedelics and the effect of psychedelics on the brain as a window onto trying to understanding brain dynamics and the NCC and so on. So there's been this notion around for a while that under in the psychedelic state, people might achieve a higher level of consciousness. It has been since, there's a lot of arguments against this, and saying it's actually the opposite. It's a lower level of consciousness. You have a breakdown when you look at the neural networks. There's a breakdown of connectivity. I was just wondering, as a model, like, there are other things we can look at. We can look at sleep, we can look at anesthesia. There are sort of these constant states where the brain is in an altered state of consciousness as a window into consciousness. This is complementary, obviously, to building models, making predictions of what these models will predict to try and understand the causal mechanisms. I was just wondering what the intuition is of the panelists here. So maybe ideally hear from each one of you on this question of looking at the altered states as a window, as opposed to building models and making predictions for the understanding of consciousness in brains and machines. Before we then turn to the audience for other questions.
Lucia, you should go first.
I want us to say something, because for experimental reasons, we very often present stimuli and we ask to report this is the subjectivity gap, right? But if you think about it, the best way ever that I can think is where I would want to understand consciousness is dreams. It's produced from inside, is very rich, it's so it's somehow that it's the causal structure of my brain that just causes that. Right? If we had a way to, really faithfully understand, the way in which those dreams are produced, I would be very happy to understand consciousness in that way. I think that psychedelics or meditation or all these other stuff, like studying people with synesthesia and etc., are our ways in which we try to experimentally create states that are controllable, right? So I turn a synesthete and then I have some lawful relation between okay, you always see red, and then I can try to disconnect the stimulus from your experience. Right? So that's because it's the trick that we try to play in a way. Like we're interested in the stimulus, we're interested in what happens in your brain, which is very obvious what happens during your dreams, right? And in some sense, it's what happens with psychedelics. You give me the same doses that you take yourself, and you have a completely different experience, right? Again, so it's more.
There are commonalities to the experiences. There's a lot of commonality, in fact, at least to the style of experience. I think psychedelics are a wonderful tool, just like many others, like visual illusions, because they create subjective states. I think this is similar to what you were saying. And we care about subjective states very much. But these subjective states are describable, and people tend to agree about what they experience, like sharpness of colors or the spatial sharpness of music, the encoding of time, and this can be analyzed. I think it's going to be a fantastic tool, because we can analyze it down to the molecular level and the circuit level, and in animals at least get really mechanistic. It looks like it's a sort of enhancement of the vectors of sensory experience. This is how I would perhaps try to capture it, that there is an amplification of vectors at the expense of others, maybe. And so suddenly, and some of these vectors become so outlandish that they land into a quite different type of representation than what you're used to. But I think they're perfectly analyzable, and it's going to be a great line of research in the next 20 years.
Just add a couple of things there to that. I completely agree. A wonderful tool for exactly the reasons that have been said. And in fact, so we've done some stuff with in collaboration with the Imperial Psychedelic Group, with Robin Cahart-Harris and David Nutt. And the first thing we did, in fact, was we applied this measure of Lempel-Ziv complexity that Stan mentioned, compressibility, because this has turned out to be quite a good biomarker of what is loosely called a level of consciousness. So the Lempel-Ziv complexity of signals goes down when you fall asleep or go under general anesthesia or in a coma. The temporal diversity of your brain, so it becomes more predictable over time when you lose consciousness. And when we applied the same method to data from the psychedelic state, it was the opposite way. The Lempel-Ziv complexity went up, which means the signal diversity went up, which means your brain dynamics were less compressible over time in the psychedelic state. And just for how you introduced the question, Karim, because this got written up as scientists finally found evidence for a higher state of consciousness in psychedelics. And we had so much trouble with the media on this, because it's like, no, we mean there's increased signal diversity, or, which is approximate. And of course, that doesn't have as much ring to it. And so why did scientists have to do this? We knew this anyway.
Anil, how do you rule out that the higher the less compressibility is not simply coming from extra noise?
Well, it's unclear quite where it's coming from. What we tried to do was very carefully distinguish it from just the changes in power spectrum that you see, because you see very dramatic changes in just raw basic spectral properties under psychedelics. And so we wanted to make sure that this change in diversity was not just trivially entailed by a change in power spectrum, and it isn't, because you can sort of control with surrogate power structure. But
it could be slow. It could be slow noise, right? I mean, unpredictability is all you need in order to get kind of diversity. And we know the dream experiences like this, which contradicts the earlier thing about dreams having a lower levels of complexity. But anyways,
well, no, dreams have the same. So if you look at levels of dreams versus waking, it's basically the same.
Oh, okay.
It's only dreamless sleep that's lower. So this is interesting, because it already dissociates sort of consciousness from wakefulness in this sense. But of course, it's only part of the story. And the other more recent analysis we did was looking at Granger causality broadly between cortical sources in MEG, and that just goes down basically across the board. So there's functional disintegration of directed functional connectivity in the psychedelic brain. Where I think the real possibilities here are to use actually microdoses rather than macrodoses. The problem with psychedelic research is that you give somebody a big dose of, they can't do anything, they'll lie in the brain scanner and whatnot, but you try and get them to do a psychophysics task, it's not going to work. But if we start giving smaller doses, so we still get the same, still working on the same receptor, it should presumably having a similar influence on the system, just much less. But now we can get much more specific about what that effect is, start to understand it in terms of, for instance, as both me and Stan were saying, does it affect this sort of integration of sensory evidence with prior expectations? Is that shifted in an interesting way that might explain something like the projected nature of visual hallucinations in the psychedelic state? Okay,
it's 12:40, so we're gonna hurry up a bit. We have not yet heard Lisa, the philosopher's perspective, maybe on this question of if you're looking at elucidative consciousness, these two approaches, looking at how brain changes across different altered states versus I have a model, it predicts certain things, and I use empirical data to see what model fits best. From a philosophical point of view, is there obviously you can always say we can use both and get as much information as we want, but intuitively, what would be your take on that?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said so far. I would just note that although I think LSD and these other kinds of modifications of consciousness might be useful for investigating state consciousness, they might not give us a great understanding of creature consciousness, right? So understanding how conscious states are modified might give us some access to maybe the contents or the ways in which processing is different, but they probably wouldn't give us much insight into the underlying mechanisms that give rise to consciousness simpliciter. And so I would be wary of inferences in that regard. But in terms of investigating state consciousness, I think it's a really plausible route. Yeah.
Awesome, perfect. So so in this case, what we'll do now is we're going to switch over to. I have a second window up here where I'm monitoring what's happening on Crowdcast. So first of all, I'd like to make a comment. We have given these poll questions to the audience. The attendees who have been answering, and I'm happy to report it seems like we have an enthusiastic and optimistic group in light of the answers. So the first question I asked was, can we build a conscious machine? 62% believe that is possible. In the attendees, 62 is possible, and 38% think it's not possible. Second question was, can science even elucidate the mystery of consciousness? Again, an optimistic group here. 81% of the attendees think, yes, science has the tools to elucidate the mystery of consciousness. Only 20% think no. And the third question we asked the audience, and this might be correlated to the fact that a lot of neuroscientists in the audience, I don't know, but the question was, what field can best help us understand consciousness? And the options that we gave is philosophy, neuroscience, AI, or other. And 68% believe neuroscience is the way to go to get a better grip on the phenomenon of the nature of consciousness. And then you have 10% for the other three options. So that's interesting, and just basically reporting, give you an idea of the audience here. Now I'm going to click on the questions, and I will read out the first question that has been upvoted by the attendees. This is a question by Olivia. And the question is as follows: can we truly evaluate consciousness, that is, what it is like to be conscious, from the outside in? We may understand brain function in animals and circuitry representations in machines, but will these ever be indicative of the actual experience they underlie, without access to the conscious report that we can get in humans? This is a question to all the panel. Feel free to jump in.
If I can just get us started with this. I mean, I think this is why it's really important to distinguish between nature questions and generative questions. So questions about what consciousness is versus questions about in virtue of what we're conscious. And for many generative questions, we start with an understanding of what it is that we're trying to explain in more fundamental terms. And so I think we actually do have a pretty good grasp of consciousness, and maybe neuroscience doesn't need to give us a better grasp of what consciousness is in order to help us understand in virtue of what it obtains. So I think maybe by separating out these questions, we can get to a more satisfactory position.
Yep. Anybody else?
I was going to say, I don't see why we could not eventually make inferences about contents of consciousness that have not even been presented before. If you take the work of Doris Tsao, for instance, which is really some of the best neuroscience at the moment, we begin to see vectors of neural activity coding for different dimensions of faces. And she's looking at this all along the circuit for face processing, and now she's getting into anterior regions of the temporal lobe and prefrontal cortex. So suppose that you have something like 50 vectors that apparently suffice to define a lot of the variation between faces. Then you can use that space to describe and even project to the outside the sort of face that a person is imagining at a given moment. You have the code, you can decode it and project it into a picture. I don't see why we couldn't do that for other types of representations, but the point is we can already do it for faces.
I mean, Stan, even in your talk, I thought you were basically showing us how to do this with baboons and monkeys, already pointing to very interesting differences in the sorts of regularities that these creatures are sensitive to, and sort of undermining the intuition we might have about similarity in some ways. And but I think the important distinction, of course, is that yes, we can understand this and gain, as you said, make inferences and gain insight into what the perceptual experiences and sort of mental spaces of other creatures might be. But of course, that doesn't mean we have those experiences ourselves. And that's not what these kinds of scientific understandings will ever deliver.
Well, the question was about whether we can evaluate consciousness. And I think if we end up with a mechanistic causal theory that is consistent with all of our observations, that will very certainly give us the means of also testing for the presence of consciousness. It's just that we're, I think, too far from answering that. And what we have now are only partial views and correlations, and we don't have a full picture. But eventually, there's no reason to believe we won't. So I don't think there's like a fundamental obstacle to being able to do that.
I mean, it doesn't have to be out of the scope. I think we're trying to, we're trying to find an answer, and so in certain ways we think that it should have it, right? But I do see the challenge, which it's not minimal, which is how to understand the mechanism by which I have a particular experience. So why space feels the way it does, why time feels the way it does, why color feels the way it does, and I think that even the best work of Doris Tsao, like it pieces, like all of these. Okay, it goes, like from the retina. We understand all of the transformations. Yet, how do we have the experience of the face is something that is kind of like missing in that account. And I would love for any of the theories at some point to be able to account for that, right? And this is, I think, the part that we are somehow missing. We have made much more progress on the threshold, like why a content gets into consciousness or it doesn't. What happens with the information that was in consciousness? We remember better, we use it more, but still with the experience itself. And even if actually it has something to do with cognition, I don't even know. It may just be there, but it may not actually do anything. I don't know.
I so disagree with you, Lucia. I'm very surprised, actually. I think Doris is decoding the experience of the animal. Of course, she is not perhaps using always subjective paradigms. Well, she is at the moment with rivalry paradigms and showing that you can decode the subjective content. Go back to the psychedelics. Imagine that you had, and this is not a dream experience, this is one that I would really like to see in the future. Imagine that you had the 50-dimensional space of Doris for faces, and now you gave psychedelics to the animal. And you saw that one of the principal components, let's say for the nose perhaps, was getting longer. And you could correlate that with the fact that the person reports that now the face has a huge nose. I think you are decoding the experience. And I think
I fully agree with you. So yes, I agree with you, but are we there? I don't think we are there yet.
No, we're very close. And I don't see any impossibility of that. I don't see that there is additional level that's missing. We just
I agree with you. I agree that hopefully there will be an answer. I think it's magic, but we haven't gotten the answer yet. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, but I guess you're saying that we already have the tools that should get us there. So the path is rare, but we're not quite there, but we have the tools, from what I understand. And so it seems like you both agree that we're not there, not now. Lisa, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I just want to ask Stan for some clarification, because I think when we're talking about spatial experience, like lengths of noses and so on, we can get a handle on it. But I think when we talk about, say, the feeling of feeling empathetic or feeling ashamed, the kind of experience that goes along with those things, I think it's very hard to think about what it would be like to decode an experience that we weren't ourselves capable of. So I'm wondering whether you think that that's just a different problem in kind, or whether the kinds of tools that apply to facial decoding could apply to these other kinds of conscious experience too.
I don't see a limit in principle. I think that there must be a research program for every particular representation. You're talking about emotional representations or second-order emotions. We need a research program to understand how they are being encoded. It was not trivial to understand what are the components of faces. For all we know, there's probably a vector code for each of the dimensions that we can experience. And as I said in my talk, we absolutely don't understand how these vector codes are combined in a syntactic manner. So when someone says something as simple as, okay, it's not blue, what I was seeing was not blue. I don't think we understand how this is being coded, because now it's not a particular color which is encoded, but it's the fact that it's not blue. It's a syntactic relationship. So there we have a lot of work to understand how the information is being encoded. And the answer potentially could be a little bit different, or maybe very different from what we know about faces and objects and so on. This is, I think, a very interesting frontier of knowledge, the human-specific ability to combine information.
May I take you on that end, Stan? So now, how about, so because you're talking about syntax, which is a really cool problem, right? But what about just a perceptual scene? So that there is a left and a right of a face, that, now in this Zoom meeting, you are in my right and not in my left, like how, those also are relations, right? Like how do we, and they should get into our experience in some way, because say, if I revert this, if I flip it, like in a mirror, it's a different experience.
Yeah, this actually makes
so how do we get there?
There's got to be such representations already in a more primitive form, perhaps in other animals. But there seems to be something quite particular in humans in being able to put everything together, regardless of where it comes from. And so that's the power of language.
I want to use that not blue example, because I find it really nice to go back to a question that Anil and I were discussing earlier. So, if I tell you the next thing is going to be not blue, clearly your brain can't enumerate all the things that can happen that are not blue. But it's very easy to, imagine that in short-term memory, you have an encoding of a rule that detects whether something is blue or not. That's going to trigger if it goes against the expectation. So you can see how you can encode it like an energy function with constraints that you expect without having to specify particular modes of the distribution, particular things that may happen. Instead, it is more abstract, and it allows you to generalize across a vast number of potential outcomes.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here so that we can move on to the next question. So thank you for all these responses. There is a question here related to Neuralink and technologies to enhance BCI and have next generation BCIs, and how maybe that technology in the future, as it progresses, our ability to record in real time brain signals and use them to decode intentions or potentially thoughts. How can that potentially advance our research in trying to understand and elucidate the fundamentals of consciousness in the future? Do you have any thoughts on that? The ability to record in real time and decode contents.
Well, just the ability to record in real time, like a huge number of neurons,
that exists,
and even better synapses, would be a huge advantage to our research.
And also the ability to stimulate too. I mean, that's the great thing here, is that we can, so much of what we've done is based on inferring mechanism from correlations that we see when people do things in brain scanners. But really to test mechanistic hypothesis, we need to intervene. Actually, psychedelics is one way of doing that. that's pretty blunt, right? You know, you just wash every serotonin to A receptor and some stuff. But targeted stimulation, in fact, stimulation of not just one area, but pattern stimulation. If you can stimulate patterns of activity,
right,
then I think that's a real game changer for computation systems.
In fact, you might be able to do the equivalent of a replay, right? To generate a thought that corresponds to some pattern of
and the prediction is completely clear. Yeah, we should be able to restore a particular state of a large enough part of the workspace that perhaps is the limit. But if you do, you should immediately induce the corresponding thought. The person should say, "Oh, I would just thought of an elephant." So this is a beautiful experiment. We want to do it, honestly, but I don't know if it would be enough to stimulate a Utah array of 100, electrodes to bias an entire assembly like that. But we're definitely going to try.
But pixels plus, Utah arrays plus.
Yeah, the truth is that these techniques are amazing, and optogenetic techniques are even better. You can play the piano on the cells. So this, when it comes in the monkey in a broader way, I think it's going to be extraordinary.
Okay, folks, this was amazing. It's 5-1. It's also way later in France right now, and in the UK, for those in Germany, for those joining us in Europe. And we will have this afternoon session that will be starting soon after lunch. So I would like to thank you really for all these amazing insights. This discussion, clearly, again, I said we knew that it's going to be frustrating because we're just scratching the surface of these questions. And clearly we need more of this. So we will be looking also at Maine, but also if you're unique to do more events like this in the coming year, 2021. And so we'll be also sending this information out to the attendees of this meeting for those who want to join for another type of meeting like this. Thanks once again. Thanks also to all the attendees right now in Crowdcast. And as I said, I see many more questions. We just don't have time to go through all of them, but we will keep a log of all these questions, and we can also share them with the attendees, with the speakers here. So thanks, Lucia. Thanks, Stan. Thank you, Yoshua. Thanks, Anil. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Karim.
This was a blast, really. And fingers crossed, this is 2020. Everything goes wrong, but so we managed to get Zoom connected inside a Crowdcast, broadcasting to the people watching on Crowdcast, and it seems to have worked fine. And all this is being recorded and streamed live on YouTube too. So fingers crossed.
Thank you for putting this together. So we should thank you for
Thank you, everybody.
Because of your hard work.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lucia. So now we're going to end this session, and the next session is the afternoon session after the lunch break, which starts at 1:20. So hopefully all of you will be eating in front of your computer anyway, so you're not going to a restaurant or anything, so that's not a problem for you. A 20-minute break is shorter than what we initially planned, but let's try to keep to the schedule. And so it's going to be Kim Stachenfeld from Google DeepMind. It's going to be talking at 1:20. Very much looking forward to that. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the speakers again and the panelists.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks all. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks a lot, Karim. This was great.
Merci, Stan. C'était super, vraiment. Vraiment content qu'on a réussi. Puis il est tard chez toi, donc...
J'aurais dû